All right, I want to stop for a moment, and we're going to be looking at a number of different prophetic pieces of writing. And when you start reading major and minor prophets, it's easy for you to go into this long dark tunnel and go, why do I need this stuff? It's ancient stuff for dead Jews, and I can't figure out what's going on. Let me just explain to you that not all the prophets are the same. The setting of the prophecy has a lot to do with what the prophet is doing. So there were 19 kings that sat on the throne of the northern kingdom. Remember, after Solomon, the kingdom splits north and south. And for 206 years, there is a kingdom of Israel, which are your northern tribes, and there's a kingdom of Judah, which are your southern tribes, which is actually Judah, and Simeon gets kind of amalgamated in there with the Negev. The important thing is this. During that 206 years of separation, God sent prophets in 4 groups. And I want to look at these 4 groups very quickly. The first group, let's put some historical frame here. Solomon starts in 968, thereabout, to 928, and he dies. And that's the end of the United Kingdom. After that, you have a division between north and south, and this is the divided kingdom. And it's 206 years long, and it starts in 928 and goes down to 722. During that period of time, there's an Israel, also sometimes known as Ephraim in the prophets, meaning northern kingdom. There's a south, which is the kingdom of Judah. Now, here's the important thing. During that window of time, those 206 years, 7 prophets are sent by God that have writings. Remember that some prophets only speak and never leave a lot of writing behind. Elijah, for instance. You don't have a book of Elijah, but you have some of the things Elijah said included within this time period from the stories of the kings, and particularly in 1 Kings 16 and following. All right. During this time, this is 7 books that God has left us with, and the earliest one we think is probably Obadiah, and Obadiah is, in a word, God telling Edom reasons why nations fail, why nations fall apart. And he's making it clear during the time of after there was raids on Israel during the time of King Jehoram, the prophet warned that Edom had been involved in ambushing the Israelites, and as a result, they were going to find themselves in real trouble. Let me suggest to you that that particular book, we're going to take a look at it, is really about how you don't turn on God's people. And it's a very, very intimate and pointed 1-page, 1-chapter story. Now, next to that, was probably right after that the letter, the writings of Joel, and this is probably written in the wake of a national disaster. We're going to go through each of these, but Joel really kind of replays a national disaster, and in 3 chapters it tells you the story of how God is going to take people of Israel, or the Jewish people I should say, not specifically during the divided kingdom Israel. God is in the future going to take the Jewish people through a time of shame and then end that time of shame with a king. And so it's a very important book. We're going to spend some time in Joel. Coming up behind Joel by just a few years, probably 10 years later, around 790, is a fig pincher or fig pricker that during his off season becomes a prophet, and his name is Amos, from a word for burden. And in 790, he actually comes and gives 6 nations around Israel, or around Israel and Judah, that God is going to deal with you. And then he turns his attention specifically to his focus on Israel and then the southern kingdom of Judah. And he's going to represent some of the judgment of God. Then sometime later, probably 10 years later, around 780, God sends a prophet from the northern kingdom, the only prophet to come from the northern kingdom, to go to Nineveh. However, Jonah takes a tour heading in the opposite direction, gets spit up on a beach, and ends up heading eventually for Nineveh. And so we're going to take a look at that. That's probably 780 BC. So I've got somewhere around, this is about 800, this is about 790, this is about 780, and this is 800s maybe as far back as 850. It's very difficult to know. This is just kind of ticking off what's going on in box number 1. After that, we have 3 more that are in a set. One of them is a major prophet, Isaiah. Along with him, Micah and Hosea. All 3 of these are contemporaries of one another. And all 3 of these are telling about God's coming in both judgment and then in restoration. And they have return, renewal, restoration, repentance, all of these major themes. And all of these are in the lower 700s, closer to the time of the destruction of the northern kingdom. So we're going to say that these, let's put these at somewhere around 750 BC. Now, box number 1 is, this is a divided kingdom. There's a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. I think I used this analogy. Tell me if you remember this one. This was the period of time of 206 years where it's like you and your brother or sister are upstairs and you're playing in your room when you're supposed to be going to sleep. And at the bottom of the stairs, you hear your father say, "I told you to go to bed. If you don't knock it off, I'm coming up there and I'm going to whoop both of you." That's the sound of these prophets. There is a northern kingdom, a southern kingdom. They're both moving on. But the second phase of prophecy is different than the first phase, because between 722 and 586, this is Judah alone. The northern kingdom is killed off. They're taken away by the Assyrians into captivity. They are gone. The 10 northern tribes are, God says, look, if you guys don't get your act together, I am coming up there and spanking you. Well, he comes up and he spanks the northern kingdom, but the southern kingdom is still operating. And between 722 and 586, there continues to be the operations in the south for another 136 years. This is God dealing with the southern kingdom of Judah. Now, what's the difference between the northern kingdom and southern kingdom in terms of who's sitting on the throne? This is going to be 9 different family lines. One that bumps off the other and takes over the throne, then gets bumped off and somebody else takes over the throne 9 times. This is one family line. Judah is all the same family, sons of David, Solomon, and the kings would follow him from the same family. So, one family, 9 lines. But these guys are destroyed and taken away. So by 722, when we're in the Galilee together, traveling in Israel, all the northern kingdom sites will be destroyed by 722 when their northern kingdom falls. If you're down in the south, though, you've got sites that go all the way to 586 when the temple is destroyed. The Assyrians took over these guys. The Babylonians took over these guys. Does any of this sound vaguely familiar? All right, what's the difference between this group of 7 prophets and this group of prophets? If you guys don't knock it off, I'm coming up there to spank you. This is, I came up and I spanked your brother. Now are you going to get your heart in line? This is when one child was taken out, the other child's still there. Knock it off, go to sleep. If I come back up here, you saw what I did to your older brother, I will now do it to you. And with that, you get Habakkuk, who cries out and says, God, you're not fair, you're not righteous. You're letting people get away with murder down here. Why are you letting them do that? And I would place that sometime just after, sometime around 700 to 690, sometime early on in that stage. At the same time, I would tell you that another one much later in the 620s comes up. Zephaniah. And this one comes from the time of King Josiah, so we know it's in the 620s. And this one will be God specifically passing a message to 5 surrounding nations that affected Judah. And then he turns and he also goes for another one, the book of comfort, the book of Nahum or Nahum. And this one appears to be somewhere just a few years later. Let's make this one about 612 BC. Now, here's the important thing. You have 7 here, you have 3 more here, but these are not the same as those. These are 2 brothers. I'm gonna get up there and whoop you. This is one's whooped. Are you going to learn from it? I've dealt with Israel. Judah, will you learn from it? The next box, tragically, is the box where they didn't learn from it because they are just like us. And you have then, during a period of 586 down to 516. It's 536 and then 516, but that's the ending point. During this period is the 3rd section. If this is divided kingdom and this is Judah alone, this is exile. This is when Judah is taken by the Babylonians, they're taken outside of their land. And what you get are a variety of writings that tell you about this period. From 586 down to 516 is a 70-year period, and it's a 70-year period that is built around the captivity. In Israel, watching things fall apart, guys, a book that gets very poor press, but I'm telling you it's a fabulous book, is what is the job of the pastor, priest, rabbi, teacher, as he watches the moral decline and as he watches his people taken into captivity? Those are the words of Jeremiah, who, by the way, also writes songs of lamentation. Echa. It's an onomatopoeia. It's oy. And he writes 5 lamentation songs that never made it hot on the hits unless you liked the blues. I feel bad. Du-dun, du-dun. You should feel bad too. Du-dun, du. Lamentations. Okay. We also have, writing from the standpoint of a contemporary, some who were taken and swept away into Babylon. Who became a prime minister in Babylon who was a Jew who was swept away? VeggieTales fame. Daniel. So we also have Daniel. And who was a priestly man who comes of age having been swept away in 597 and taken to Babylon, and he grows up there, and the major part of his life story is that he takes along with him a young wife who dies, and God says, you cannot cry. Who's that? This will be Ezekiel. So these guys are in Babylon. I can't write. And this guy's in Jerusalem. And it's kind of 2 different views. Here's one end, here's the other. The guys as they're leaving, the guys as they're arriving, and what happens to them there. And then you begin the 4th section, the part that's simply referred to as post-exile or post-exilic prophets. And these prophets include, by the way, the book of Ezra is not one book, it's actually 2 books. The book of Ezra has, in the first 6 chapters, it's actually the scroll of Zerubbabel, but we'll call it Ezra 1 through 6, which is actually the scroll of Zerubbabel. Sheshbazzar and Zerubbabel. They come back and go to rebuild the temple, and sometime later, as the temple is supposed to be being rebuilt, they come back in the 520s down to 516, and they're supposed to be 516 here is the beginning, and goes all the way down to about 400, post-exilic prophet. Zerubbabel comes back and they begin to build, and then a prophet rises up to say, you know, when you came back, you guys were working really hard on my house, and then you found Great-Grandma's ranch, and you said, let's go look at Great-Grandma's ranch, and then you got more excited about Great-Grandma's ranch than you did about building my house, and I am telling you, I am living in a shack, and you are living in paneled houses, and you have messed up your priorities, and I am the Lord. And that would be Haggai. Then, a few years behind him is another very important prophet who comes along and says, I have plans for Jerusalem, and they are big plans, and they include a Messiah, but they also include a tribulation and great destruction, and that is Zechariah. Now, when you continue, during this time, meanwhile, back in the Persian court, there's another story. A story of a man who went out with his army and got whooped and came back and was really upset, kicked out his queen, needed another story of Esther and Mordecai. And it's rooted right in the heart of this story. And, by the way, we'll put this around 480 BC. Then if you go on, there was another wave that needed to come to Jerusalem because they had built up the temple, but they had run out of gas. Then they finally finished the temple, and God had given them great promises, but they weren't doing everything that they needed to do. And God brought yet another great man to help them to organize the people, and this time to build up the walls of Jerusalem, and that will be Nehemiah, 444 BC, and that will be an important date because the promise of Messiah's coming in Daniel 9, 26 and 27 is from the date that I send back someone to build the walls, gates, and lay the foundations of the plaza, from that day you are to begin counting till Messiah comes. And if you take the prophecies in Daniel 9, you will arrive at the year 30. In other words, if you say, start counting from there, and there you will go 69 sevens, you will come up to 173,880 days. If you take that number of days, it ends up being Jesus coming down in Luke 19 saying, I told you 173,880 days ago I was coming, why aren't you ready? The Bible is incredibly specific about its prophetic materials. Now, Nehemiah is not the last book, though. Sometime later, you'll have another book that will be important. Somewhere around 400, you have two other books that are coming together. One of them, My Messenger, Malachi. And the other one is the Reader's Digest recap of the entire Hebrew Scriptures. What is it? The last book of the Hebrew Scriptures, the book of Chronicles, which starts with Adam and ends with the return. It's the shortened version of the whole Old Testament. If you lost all of your Old Testament and had Chronicles, you'd still have the story. It's just it'd be a lot smaller. So the Chronicles is a retelling of the whole story back to Adam. And we get it from just 400 years before Jesus. Then, from the time of Malachi, this ends on a promise that there's going to come one who's going to separate the fathers from their children. There's going to come one who's going to call for repentance. And the next thing you see is the stories of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And the beginning place, John the Baptizer, whose message was from Malachi. So 400 years go by, God is still speaking, he's still meeting people in dreams, he's still speaking into their lives, but no written prophets until a great prophet comes out with the message of Malachi, and that's the prophet of John the Baptizer, or John the Immerser, might be an appropriate way to say it.